Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining us for an important topic, one that is a priority for many entrepreneurs who are in the early stages of starting a business. My name is Dana Wagner. I'm the project manager of the Hire Immigrants program at the Global Diversity Exchange. We here are a think and do tank at Ryerson University's Ted Rogers School of Management in Toronto. Our business is linking immigration to prosperity, and one channel of ours is the Hire Immigrants program, which is a platform for employers and entrepreneurs to find and share practical solutions for the types of challenges that we're talking about today. Sponsoring this webinar today is RBC Royal Bank, a valued partner of ours at the Global Diversity Exchange. RBC is a leader in the financial services sector and in the wider Canadian business community for innovation in products and services that support newcomers to Canada, both on the personal and business ends of getting started. And so many of our RBC colleagues approach their work through lived experience with immigration to Canada, and that rich diversity, no doubt, drives much of the passion and innovation. Like we do here at Hire Immigrants, RBC recognizes that setting up newcomer entrepreneurs for success makes sense for our economy and for our communities. Immigrants to Canada, as everyone on this call knows, are major contributors to business creation. Immigrants start businesses at a faster rate than born Canadians. They are also more likely to export beyond the United States, linking domestic consumers and business networks to international markets. And I'm speaking about many of those joining us on this call. But this is the bright side. We also know that there are some distinct challenges that immigrants face that can affect the success and growth of their business. Some of those challenges can be mitigated, and it is a topic of legal basics of starting a business that brings us all together today. Talking to a lawyer is a core first step for newcomer entrepreneurs to learn about the legal basics for businesses in Canada. It's important early preparation that prevents later problems, and it's a key component of good business planning. It's only natural then that joining us today are two experts on this topic, a lawyer and a business planning expert who is himself an immigrant and an entrepreneur. I'll tell you just briefly about them, and then we'll get going. It's such a pleasure to be joined today by Matthew Wiens, who is the Director of Corporate Pro Bono Programs at Pro Bono Ontario, where he designs and implements charitable projects that improve access to justice. Prior to joining PBO, Matthew was a sessional professor at McMaster University, and after law school, Matthew began volunteering for Law Help Ontario, a program that provides a range of services for low-income, self-represented litigants who do not qualify for legal aid but cannot afford legal counsel. John Warren is our second presenter today. John is currently the Senior Director and Entrepreneur in Residence for Entrepreneurship Programs at Mars Discovery District here in Toronto. He is an experienced entrepreneur and advisor. In 2009, John founded Clear Sky Advisors, a research and advisory firm serving stakeholders in the wind and solar energy space. His experience includes 3 years in management consulting and 6 years working for industry advisory firm Gartner Inc. in Europe, Canada, and the U.S., 7 years working in the software industry, and he's got 2 successful software startups under his belt. So we're so lucky to be joined by them both today. And a very quick word about who else is in this virtual room. We're a diverse group. We have over 200 participants registered, a great number of whom are entrepreneurs. Others are service providers. We're a primarily Canadian group here with some of our international audience joining us. So welcome to our Canadian participants, some returning and some new, and welcome to our international colleagues. Now we will briefly hear from each presenter, followed by a conversation and questions from participants. So again, I encourage you to be chatting with us via your chat box and save your questions for the end of our session, and we'll make sure we leave a good deal of time for you to get those in. And now let's begin, and we'll begin with the law. So Matthew, please tell us what everyone listening in needs to know about the basics.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So like Dana said, I represent Pro Bono Ontario. Our mission, as you can see on the slide, is to bridge the gap between lawyers who want to donate their services and low-income Ontarians whose problems do not attract government funding. Recently, we've merged with another charity called Connect Legal, which some of you may have heard of, which was an amazing program which provided legal assistance to newcomer entrepreneurs. Through the merger, we're able to greatly increase our services and ensure that immigrant entrepreneurs have access to pro bono legal services for when they're starting their business. And I think Dana mentioned, how much immigrant entrepreneurs actually contribute to our economy and how important it is. And one of the most important things that they can do very early on is address some of the legal issues, both to create a strong legal foundation for success, but also what we like to call sort of preparing yourself to ensure that even if one business idea doesn't work out, that you are protected and that you are, it's ensured that you can try again. So it's an exciting time starting a business, and as many of you know that are probably on the line, starting a small business requires your head to be in 30 different places at once. And the most important part at the beginning is getting it up and going, building the website, finding a client base, building a product. And what most people forget is that all of those things have major legal implications. And, studies show that most people either don't have the money in the early stages to actually afford a lawyer, or they believe that seeing a lawyer is not necessary until something goes wrong, or in the case of many immigrant entrepreneurs, they're unfamiliar with the legal requirements of operating a business in Ontario. And all of these things are common experiences shared by everybody, but they can be very difficult to overcome unless there's services and information available to how to address these legal needs. So like I said, if you don't address complex issues early, it can slow the growth of your business and really inhibit your ability to turn it into a reality. All of these things are early level supports, and in the early stages when you're thinking about what product you're going to produce and when you're thinking about who your customer base is going to be, you're trying to bring all of these things together. And what I like to tell people is identify what you're good at, really. Identify where your strengths are. So if you know you're good at working with the public, if you know you're good with designing a product, or you know you're good at importing something, focus on that, trying to understand the complexities of the law and trying to understand the really early responsibilities and rights and obligations that are put into place can be extremely difficult, even for practicing lawyers. And so you really need to understand and at least identify that speaking to a lawyer or getting information early is a really important component. It can also save you a lot of time and money as your business grows. So, we do a much larger presentation where we talk about all the possibilities and the fines and the problems that can come with it. But I don't want to sort of, bring the mood down on it. So instead, we're just going to focus on the ability to get early advice and the ability to really focus on building your business. So many of the common problems faced by newcomer entrepreneurs are lack of funding, lack of support from the government and other organizations, cultural differences, familiarity with regulatory framework in Canada, lots of government red tape, and finding qualified workers in building markets. The interesting thing is that most of these can easily be addressed or are, in fact, legal issues. So, for example, we have up on the slide here, the lack of funding, having a proper legal structure can help legitimize your business. It can help attract private investment and can also allow you to access small business loans and grants. And we'll talk about what sort of having a proper legal structure looks like. Similarly, with the lack of support, having a proper legal structure can also make you eligible for a number of government supports, incubators, and programs that you wouldn't necessarily have access to until you've put it all together. Familiarity with the regulatory frameworks in Canada, understanding the legal implications for your particular business, it will really help you gain a familiarity with the industry and help you grow your business. You're going to understand what it looks like, what permits are required, what licenses are required. And by doing that research and by informing yourself and getting advice on what those look like, you're actually going to learn the marketplace, and it's actually going to enhance your ability to conduct your business. And finally, the government red tape. Understanding your basic legal obligations and requirements really makes navigating your sector far easier. Many hurdles seem insurmountable at first that you really can't figure out, what form needs to go where. One of the most common issues we see is the online resources from the government and other organizations are fantastic, but they generally only take you from step 1 to 3 of a 10-stage process. And so without sort of, getting assistance and without asking those questions early and learning what it looks like, you may not be actually going all the way through, which may seem like there's a lot of barriers you have to face. And again, part of that is just really understanding the information, and the other part is making sure you have access to that information because, as entrepreneurs, you have 100 other things to worry about. So this slide that we're looking at is what we call the Risk Identification Index for small businesses. They're a set of very simple questions that actually have very large, far-reaching legal implications. And conversely, they have really simple legal solutions. So when you look at this, everyone needs to ask themselves these questions. And not only does it affect the legal implications or your legal responsibilities, they can actually help you grow a much more comprehensive and large business. We say to a lot of people that when you're putting together a business plan or your strategy or you're applying for a small business loan or a grant and you need to prepare the documentation, including how your business is going to be structured, how you're going to deal with certain things, you really understand that the whole sort of picture of your business. So if you see, what sort of business are you going to operate? While this may seem like an extremely simple question, the reality is that the law is what we call generally specific. So it's meant to apply to everyone, but it applies on a case-by-case basis. So until you've really narrowed down what kind of business you're going to be operating, who you're going to be working with, each business and each type of sector has its own legal implications that you need to become familiar with. What assets do you want to protect? Obviously, there's a large difference. If you have been saving for a child education fund or a retirement fund, or you've put money into the business, or you own a home, these are assets that you want to protect, and you want to ensure that how you've structured your business will keep those safe, and it will allow you to put resources and time into a business without the worry of having a ripple effect that could actually damage your life as a whole. Who will your most important contracts be with? Are you going to be a distributor or a supplier? Are you working with the public? Again, all of these have very discrete legal issues that you need to address. So these are the questions you have to ask yourself. If someone sued you, who do you think it would be? Identifying. That question helps you identify your marketplace. Nobody wants to be sued. It's an unfortunate reality of life. But if you look at the previous 3 on the index scale, and if you've looked at your legal issues and what you need to get early on, this can be avoided, and this can actually make this process a lot easier. If someone didn't pay you, what would you do about it? Early stage businesses are relying on revenue coming in all the time. And what would happen if you weren't able to get paid? Did you look at your contract? Was there provisions in a contract? All of these things are extremely important. And finally, if you got sick, what would happen to your business? Businesses are very unique in a sense that you need to plan and you need to think very early on about what's the most important priority today, what kind of resources do you have today, and where do you want to see the business in 2, 3, 5, 10 years? You want this to be a family business. Do you want it to grow? And depending on the answer to that question, will have a number of legal implications on how you should actually structure your business. So you should always use this index when first starting. Like I said, it will give you a much larger picture of your business, and it will help you ask the questions. Part of working with a lawyer, whether it's through pro bono or otherwise, is getting what we call, being lawyer ready, making sure that when you do access services that are available to you, you've narrowed it down. One of the common issues that I see generally is that the questions may be a year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 months ahead of the questions they should be asking now. But if you go through that risk identifier and you narrow it down, working with a lawyer, working with an organization, building your business plan can really focus that in. So the answers will not only help you identify your early legal needs, but they're also going to help you influence the structure and growth trajectory of your particular business. So again, we just have the index up because I wanted to emphasize how important this is for you to go through and really answer these questions. It's going to get you lawyer ready. It's going to get your business to build that nice, strong legal foundation early on. And it's going to answer questions like, what type of business structure should I choose? Should I incorporate? Should I be a sole proprietor? Am I in a partnership? What kind of protections come with that? Do I need to have a contract reviewed? Is a verbal contract enough? These are all questions that you should be asking yourself and identifying very early on, because as you do those things and as you work through this index, even though the questions may seem simple, they have far-reaching legal implications, all of which can be handled very easily in the early stages. So we just sort of have gone through some of these things. We notice with a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs we're working with, we see issues like, can you register your company in multiple jurisdictions? How is that going to work? One of the things we see all the time is how are you going to protect your business name and your reputation? This is a very common legal question that we have. And again, there are very simple steps that you can take to address these issues early on. We talk about, and it's again, I don't like to bring it down, but we talk about the idea of succeeding in business, and that's where everyone's hope is. But the reality is, often through no fault of anyone's own, businesses do fail, whether they are too early, or the idea is too early, or they've entered a saturated market, or the timing just may not be right. But the idea that we kind of focus on, especially in the legal arena, is if you are going to fail, if a business is going to fail, make sure it fails so that you can start again, so that there's not long-lasting effects, so that you don't have to worry about fines or lawsuits or anything like that. Because the idea is that if you address these early, so if you protect your business name and your reputation, if you have a standard contract, even if the business doesn't work out, you're ready to try again, and you're ready to try that idea again, or you're ready to try a new idea. So it's as much about protection, both of yourself, your business idea, your families, as much as sort of ensuring that you can keep starting again and that you can keep building your business. These are very, very important legal questions and concepts that come into play very, very early and can be particularly difficult, especially for newcomer small business owners. Language barriers, as we mentioned, is a huge issue. Understanding the law, understanding the process, but all of these questions do have answers. It's just finding the right person to work with. So we just sort of have the importance of law in business because it's so often forgotten. But, like I said, many newcomer entrepreneurs do have particular legal issues that can seem insurmountable. But I'm here to tell you that they are not, that everything has a solution. Everything has a very important legal question or legal process attached to it that can make sure that you can cut through all of those things. And building the strong legal foundation will obviously greatly increase your chances of success. It will allow you to grow. It'll get you investment ready. It'll allow you to take on partners. It'll allow you to open another location or diversify your portfolios, all of those things. But the one message I want to make sure that everyone gets is get this help early. Never wait for something to happen. It's far more expensive and a lot more difficult to unpack a problem or a situation once it's happened. The big thing is to get it as early as possible. So we contact there, you're welcome to. Our clinic helps newcomer entrepreneurs access free legal services from the legal profession. We create these opportunities for lawyers and law firms and in-house counsel to come and volunteer and to meet with you and to make sure that all of these issues can be addressed early on. 45-minute appointments as often as you want, and we're always happy to see all the new businesses come in and to really support this group. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. What an excellent overview of some sobering risks, but also the strategies to mitigate them. So now from the law to the business plan. As Toronto's commercialization hub, Mars Discovery District gives entrepreneurs what they need most, a home with access to network, capital, and advisors. So again, we're very lucky to have John Warren with us. And John, please, over to you to tell us about where the legal questions fit into business planning.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you for hosting this webinar. Thanks also to all of you who've been participating so far. So at Mars, our mission is to help drive innovation in Canada, and part of what we do is help entrepreneurs grow their business in a variety of ways, partly through education, partly through advisory services, partly to inflict change in policy and whatnot. You know, I come from the education and group advisory part of Mars, and as part of that, I worked with over 1,000 entrepreneurs, relatively early stage. A very large portion of those are immigrant entrepreneurs. And as Dana said initially, I am an immigrant myself, almost 12 years in Canada now, and I founded a couple of companies. So what I wanted to do in this presentation is just share some of my experience, both in terms of how companies evolve, but also some practical reflections on the legal issues related to that particular process. So just before we get going, I just wanted to say a disclaimer here. Unlike Matthew here, I don't have a legal background, so please don't hold anything that I say against me. I'm going to share my personal opinions, but please don't construe this as legal advice. If you need legal advice, you should contact a professional. So what I wanted to talk about first of all is the key stages of a company creation process, and then I wanted to overlay that with both the early stage legal issues as well as the growth stage legal issues before we head into the Q&A. So what we've been seeing is that when you start a business, it makes sense to think of the business as going through stages of growth. Each stage has a slightly different purpose, and the startup phase, it's where you think about, okay, how do you make this business viable? So it's where, if you're a product-based business, you try to establish the product, you start to figure out who's your customers, you try to figure out what's the pricing and the marketing, but essentially, there's a lot of things that you don't know, you're investigating it, and in this phase, the sort of the characteristics of the management part is that you're iterating and you're searching. In that phase, because of the uncertainty in the early stages, we advise a lot of the entrepreneurs to keep their investment as low as possible, to keep the risk exposure as low as possible, and until they actually figure more things out about the pricing, the market, the messaging, and all the things that make up for a good business. So, this is the kind of the search phase, I would call it, of the business. And the purpose of that search phase overall is actually to figure out what your business model is. And with that, I mean, how essentially are you going to make money? What are you going to do to attract customers? What is it that specifically you're going to offer them? And what are the ways that you will be getting customers through your doors? How do you communicate with them, and how do you relate to your customers? Once you have figured out what your business model is, then you move into a more sort of traditional way of management. The type of management, and when I say that, it would be typically the type of management processes they'll teach you in business school, and that we can read about in most books that we find about business and management. And because now we're more sort of execution oriented, we're not searching and iterating in the same way as we are in the startup phase. We know what we're going to build, and the trick is now just to manage that build-out process. So if I take and overlay these two stages with both the purpose as well as potential legal issues for each stage, it looks something like this. So at the early stage, companies are searching, they're learning, they're potentially iterating to figure things out. In this phase, you're working a lot on your product. Potentially there's some intellectual property that you might want to think about protecting. You might think about what's the purposeful way of incorporating, going back to what Matthew discussed as well. And maybe you're not alone in this venture. Maybe there's somebody else with you, and you have the business partner or co-founder, as we like to call it. And those are the sort of the main legal issues to address at that particular point in the stage. And I'll go into more detail a little bit later on. At the growth stage, you're trying to, as I said earlier, you're trying to execute and grow. So you have a different type of issues that you're facing then. So first of all, as you're growing, you might be adding staff in the form of employees. You might be adding financing, you might be needing growth capital, you might be adding customers, hopefully, and some of the growth might be facilitated by adding partners. All of those come with their own set of legal issues, and I'll talk about that shortly. So with regards to IP, obviously the key question is if you've made a discovery that can be patented. I'm not a patent guy, I want to preface that, but there's some real practical things about it. If you have something you want to patent, you can't start talking about it in public until you've actually filed a provisional patent protection. That's something that you can do. The provisional patent filing, it covers US, it's not possible in Canada. It gives you about a 12-month period to figure out whether you want to do a full patent filing. The US Patent and Trade Office actually has very, very good resources, and I know of entrepreneurs that have gone through the process of filing their own provisional patents completely on their own without help of legal advisor, because the support that you get through that patent office website is really, really strong. So if you think you have something patentable, at least I would start looking at it. If the whole sort of patent language is very strange for you, I'd advise you to look for a lawyer with a specialty in IP protection. But filing of a provisional patent is a lot more affordable than a full patent filing, but it does give you protection. The minute you start talking about your product, you miss out on the opportunity of filing a patent if you have sort of made the knowledge broadly available. On incorporation, there's really two questions for me that are key. First of all, do you need to protect your family's assets from business risk? So are you doing stuff, is there things that you're doing in your business that means that you're incurring some degree of liability? Then you might want to set up a separate sort of entity from that sort of protects your personal economy. It could be both a for-profit corporation, it could be a not-for-profit corporation, but that would be as opposed to a sole proprietorship. The other question to ask is do you anticipate needing to raise funds to finance growth of your business? And specifically, if you want to get growth capital, or what we call venture capital, you need to be a corporation. Not-for-profit companies do not have shares that they can give to other owners, so you'd have to be a corporation if you wanted to grow in that particular way. There are things you can do as a not-for-profit, but it's a little bit less straightforward. And then the final part in the early stage, co-founders. You might already have a co-founder, or you may have identified that you don't necessarily have all the capacity or the skills to execute on your plan, so you're looking to add a co-founder. In that case, what you need is a shareholder agreement. So the shareholder agreement is different from the incorporation documents, but what they do is that they talk about the relationship between anyone who as an owner in the corporation. Initially, typically, it will be maybe you and one or two business partners, but if you are going down the path of getting financing, that shareholder agreement needs to be amended so that anyone who you add from an equity perspective, whether it's a venture capital, an angel investor, or something like that, can also be part of that agreement. So in addition to sort of addressing some of the questions about how do you add people to this agreement and how do you get rid of people from that agreement, the shareholder agreement also talks about the basics of governance for the corporation, and it's really worthwhile just thinking about how do you want to do that. Thinking about governance is really, really important. You need, the law says that you have to have board meetings and whatnot, but beyond that, there are some important points in terms of how are you making decisions, who has the right to bind the corporations and so forth. And it's a bit, if you're starting a business with co-founder, it's a bit like prenuptial agreement, similar to what people that enter marriage would sometimes sign. And it's actually some really worthwhile conversations to have, because if you're going into business with somebody, that is a really long-term relationship. And you want to make sure that you talk about the things that are important, both when things are going well and when things are not going well. And failure to do that is only going to set you up for trouble later on. So having a shareholder agreement, it doesn't have to be very sophisticated. There are long ones and there are short ones out there, and I've seen both. In the beginnings, you don't need a particularly long one. You need one that is appropriate for the stage of the business that you're at, and that can regulate the relationship between you and your immediate co-founders. Another thing to think about with the shareholder agreement is whether or not you have a type of business that would like to give ownership to some of the staff. That is also something that is facilitated through the shareholder agreement. Moving on to the growth stage, I just wanted to say sort of generally that at the growth stage, things get really, really busy. You have a lot of things that you want to do. There's a lot of moving pieces. You're adding customers. They want your attention. You're adding staff. It takes a long time, and they want your attention. You're out there. You're looking possibly to get financing, and you're looking for partners. So, this, the growth stage, it really helps to put some thought into how you want to relate to all these different stakeholder groups, to your employees, to your customers, to your potential finance partners, and other partners in the business, and as much as possible have standard agreements that you can work from. That helps facilitating adding customers without it becoming a major project every time, and the same with employees. So having a standard set of agreements, I found, is essential in this particular phase. So just going into a little bit more detail on each of the stakeholder groups. So in terms of employees, you should have an employment contract. Even if you don't, the labor legislation in Canada is very strong in protecting the employee side. So you don't necessarily gain anything by not having a employment contract. You can never agree for anything less than what the labor legislation actually says. So having an employment contract just means that you're able to show to the people that you're onboarding what they can expect from you and what you expect in return, and at a very basic level, and how to govern your relationship. So I think it's really important, and it gets any kind of new employees off to a really good start to have employment contracts. There are times when you would ask, in addition to just a standard employment contract, employees to sign confidentiality agreements. If they do get in touch with things that are confidential to your business that you want to protect, you can ask them to have hold that in confidence. You could also have non-compete provisions, meaning that if they leave your business, they're not allowed to go into direct competition with you in somehow. In my practical experience, there are limitations to what you can put into a non-compete provision. It has to be reasonable, otherwise the court would set it aside, and they simply won't honor what you wanted from that agreement. So, for instance, if you're operating in a particular market, let's say that all the big banks are your customers, then you can't necessarily just say in a non-compete agreement that any financial services company is off limits for an employee that decides to leave you and set up a corporate business. You'd actually have to name each customer so that and this is an agreement, so that that named customer has to be on the paper that is signed by both you and your employee in that sense. On the customer side, the agreement is there to protect the relationship. So at the time when you generally get a new customer, everything is good, the sky's bright, and both of you are excited about being in business together. There are things that can happen along the way that might mean that it's not always as rosy. So there really is important to have some sort of a discussion with your customers about how you manage the good times and how you manage the bad times in that relationship. There's also an element to liability, like what happens if you're a new company and you can't necessarily deliver on your performance, the product or whatever you said doesn't happen. What are you liable for? So having that put down on paper is a really, really important thing, so that you protect your business in that sense. Financing, if you have an investable asset, Matthew discussed this as well, then you can sell a share of the company to raise funds. And to do that, obviously, you have to have an incorporated company and you have to have a shareholder agreement. Partners, obviously, you want to discuss with them how you share both the obligations and how you share the gains. So the final point I wanted to make is about choosing a legal counsel. This is not just about choosing a service provider that ends up being an expense. In my experience, I've been fortunate to work with some really, really good legal counsel, and they've been significant assets to my business. They've been making very, very powerful introductions for me. They're always looking to add connections. They want to be a partner in the business and not just looking at the legal aspects. So keep that in mind as you're preparing to look for legal counsel. Have conversations with multiple people before you settle for somebody, and make sure at the very least that they have strong subject matter expertise in your field, so that you can benefit from that. Going back to the first point I made about intellectual property, if you have a corporate lawyer is not always the same as will not always be the same as the IP lawyer. Sometimes their IP lawyers can be quite specialized. So that's in my experience. You may end up with two different service provider in that sense. They may be from the same firm, but it may be two different individuals.
Well, thank you so much, John, for your insights on some of the key legal questions along the stages of early startup and then growth. And it's wonderful having someone who can deliver the personal insight as well as you can. So thank you. And it's now time to move on to our Q&A and your participation. So please move over from the chat box now and submit your questions in the Q&A box, which you should see in front of you now, while I field the first question to our speakers. In the meantime, I'll just note that you'll see a resources box on the bottom of your screen. And this PowerPoint file is a legal guide developed by Pro Bono Ontario that you can click and download. So a first question for you, John, which may be on many of our minds. You sound like a great guy to go out with and just hear all of the stories from your interactions with so many of the interesting entrepreneurs who are orbiting around you as an advisor. So what's a typical legal mistake that you see kind of again and again in the startup phase?
Sure. I would have to say that the one we encounter a lot at Mars are founders. They may be really good friends that have gone into business. They have a lot of fun. They're building a great product, and they totally neglect to talk about the hard things in how they're going to manage their relationship, which is what you need to do when you sign a shareholder agreement. Starting a business is really tough, and at some point the priorities, even between the best of friends, might shift. And if you don't have a legal agreement, that might be the end of the business. So the shareholder agreement can actually protect your business in that way. And I would encourage you, the minute you have somebody else with you in your business, you have these conversations. It's the right thing to do, and it'll set you up nicely later on.
That's wonderful. And I'm sure you've run into many more than that, but keeping in mind that shareholder agreement is a great point for everyone to keep in mind. Now, Matthew, a question for you, and I've seen a few people begin to raise this question of a budget already in the chat. So I think a lot of people are just beginning to wonder about the cost. We know that legal services aren't always free, aren't always as affordable as they are with Pro Bono Ontario, especially. Mm-hmm. So if you can offer any insight on maybe what to budget, or more importantly, because it would be so different for everybody, how to budget for legal services.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like we said earlier, the law is generally specific, and so it's applies to everyone. It's sort of the blanket on top, but on a case-by-case basis, it can be different, and so the costs can be much different, and this can depend on how frequently you get the advice, what type of business, the structure of it, whether just going to John's point, intellectual property protecting intellectual property is so important in the early stages. However, it can also be one of the most expensive areas of law to deal with. So it really becomes a cost-benefit analysis in the early stages of how much to assign to receiving legal fees, how much you need to protect, versus what's the priority in the business. And truthfully, unfortunately, there is no bright line where you can say, in this situation you need to, in this situation you can't. Coming to presentations like this, getting the information is so important because it allows you to at least identify, oh, maybe I should speak to somebody with this. So it's really, really important. But the problem is that it can range. It can range anywhere from $1,000 to $20,000, depending on what you're getting advice on. And so in the early stages, when you're allocating such scarce resources, it's so important to learn as much as possible, get as much information, talk to whatever resources that are available out there to make sure that you're what we call, like I said before, lawyer ready, so that you're going in with your questions and you're going in to make sure it will really, really make it much simpler and much more cost effective to work with this and to work with lawyers and to really sort of build your business out and build that strong legal foundation.
Thank you, Matthew. So we've got an excellent question. We've got a number of them, so I would encourage everyone to keep on entering your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat. But from one of our participants, we have the question, maybe John, you can begin by taking this, about the difference between an IP lawyer and other types of lawyers. So maybe just to very quickly tell us exactly what an IP lawyer is and why that's different from others.
Well, I would say it is just has a little bit to do with the specialization. So IP lawyers deal with predominantly with issues around intellectual property. So if you have something of a discovery or you have information data that you own, then you may want to protect that in some way. So they can help you with the various ways of protecting that. It becomes a significant asset for your business, everything from your brand to specific data that you have and whatnot. And you want to make sure that that's something that they can protect for you. And because the intricacies of patent filings, they have to be very accurate, and there's a whole bunch of implications around a patent filing and a strategy for managing intellectual property that intellectual property lawyers have experience with that a sort of a general corporate lawyer probably will not. So it really is, if you have intellectual property, that needs to be protected, you may want to consider going to somebody, to a law firm that has some IP expertise.
We're getting lots of questions about resources, so how to continue some of the learning and find out more maybe from both of your organizations and beyond. So maybe Matthew and John, you can each just take a quick moment to, if you've got maybe top 1 or 2 resources that you would like to point people to. So legal resources that are available for people online.
Matthew, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I do sort of always say with caution that there are an infinite amount of resources obviously out there, and looking at them and reading them with a keen eye is what's so important, because as much as there's great information, there's also a lot of misinformation out there. And when you are entering this, going on the theme of informing yourself of what it looks like, really focusing it down and really finding what you need. So for example, when starting a business, the government of Ontario and the federal government have great resources available, guides about setting up your business, incorporating your business. And, Industry Canada and through the province, you really want to look for those sort of resources that are produced by the government, by a credible source, because there is so much misinformation out there. So in terms of resources, really going for someplace like a government body or a larger organization. Mars, for example, has fantastic resources and templates on their website. But just always be careful. Always make sure that the resources you're accessing are what you would kind of consider credible. But really the main thing is government resources are out there. The government wants businesses to grow. It's so important for them. They make up such large portions of our economy. Small businesses are key. 98%, I think, of all small businesses in Ontario, so between, I think, 1 and 25 people are small businesses. So there are a lot of great government resources out there. It's just learning how to access them and figuring out which ones are best.
Great.
Yeah, so Matthew, I'll just add to that. We have created on the Mars website a lot of resources, and I just put a link into our chat that can take you directly to the legal resources. And somebody else earlier on asked about where they could find demographic statistics and all that kind of stuff. So I posted a link to that as well in the chat box.
That's great. Thanks so much, John. Now, we've had an interesting question about the nature of international agreements. So someone based in Canada may be signing an agreement or having a partner or even supplier, distributor abroad. So without getting too technical here, maybe, Matthew, I can begin with you. Some questions that you might advise that people ask themselves when entering into an agreement with a partner or another party outside of Canada.
So jurisdictional issues are very difficult to address, and they can be very overwhelming because every area, provinces are separate. There's federal law, but they do have very different laws. And so the idea is, once you've formed your business, so if you're formed in Ontario, but you're doing business with someone in a different jurisdiction, when you go back to your risk identifiers that I pointed out earlier, you'll have things like, if you were to be sued, who would sue you? And that's identifying someone that you may be doing business with is in a different jurisdiction. And when you have someone in a different jurisdiction, depending on the contract, so when you go back to another risk identifier and say, who will your contracts be with, depending on the contract, it can have a clause in it that speaks to which jurisdiction applies if there were to be a dispute or anything like that. So it's incredibly important both for small businesses and for our larger economy to work within these frameworks and to work internationally, but you have to be very careful. You have to watch it with a keen eye and get advice, because on top of the contractual relationship between yourself, the small business, and the supplier, the distributor in a different country, you also have import and export tariffs. You also have free trade agreements. So it's actually far more complex to look at that, but that's why it's so important to get advice, because oftentimes we've seen scenarios where someone's doing business with someone in a foreign jurisdiction, and in the contract it would say that, if there's any disputes, it will be handled by a court in that jurisdiction. Now you're stuck in a position of having to defend yourself somewhere else. So, watching that's very important. But it's such an important part of business, and so many businesses are grown off international relationships, that you just have to be very careful about it and get advice very early on before entering into these agreements. But certainly it's something that's easily resolvable within our legal system.
Yeah, just to add a practical comment on that. So one business that I was involved with, we had a lot of customers in the U.S. And on occasion, some of these customers, they would ask us to have the jurisdiction for the agreement be their home state. When I discussed that with legal counsel at that time, he said, that the state laws in the U.S. vary a lot, and some of them can be less favorable than others. So we used to have as a default that if a U.S. client wanted us wanted to have a different jurisdiction than Ontario for the agreement, then we would suggest New York State. Our legal counsel said he was comfortable with that. I don't know if that was particular to that legal counsel or if New York State is just more similar to Ontario and for that reason was okay. But there were other states that he most definitely did not want. And most of the time, immediately once we suggested some U.S. jurisdiction, our clients were fine with it.
Thank you both. We've got another, I guess, tough question that I'll ask you to handle without going into too much detail, but to provide a bit of advice. We have a question from Khadija on how you get a foolproof protective copyright. She's asking specifically about arts and culture business, but maybe just more generally, if you could answer what your thoughts are on developing a foolproof protective copyright agreement, as she says that creative projects are frequently copied by competitors just by tweaking a bit of the design or production and calling it new.
I think this is a great question, and part of what we do on top of helping immigrant entrepreneurs is actually our clinic also helps artists and arts-based nonprofits. So this is an issue we see all the time, and this links very nicely back to what John said about the importance of intellectual property. So intellectual property is so much more than patents. It's trademark, it's copyright, it's anything to protect an original idea, name, brand, logo, and that's why IP is so important so early on. We tell a lot of people that while you're incorporating your business, while you're protecting yourself, you need to be thinking about your intellectual property as well. And this goes especially for artists and working in cultural businesses, because things are so easily copied now and put online and on Instagram and Twitter, and it goes out through the world. So the Canadian government, recognizing how important intellectual property is, both in terms of trademarking business names and copyrighting photos, because you're building your business off a reputation. People get to know your photos or your designs or your writing or your business name and logo, that they have made, and John mentioned it, CIPO, the Canadian Intellectual Property Office. It's cipo.gc.ca. And it is a fantastic resource for people to be able to access things like copyrighting the originals of works and making sure. So, very sort of broadly in copyright law, when you take the picture, you do own the copyright, but you can register it with the government, which adds an extra level of protection and ensures that if someone is copying your ideas or your brand or your logo, that you're protecting your business, because that's exactly what it is. So it's very important. That intellectual property is a key component, and copyright is a very important part of that. We help lots of people with that.
So we have just time for, I think, a few more questions. We have a question from one of our audience members, Ricardo, on insurance, which is something we haven't really talked about much. So is there any kind of insurance advice, Matthew and John, that you would like to give to whoever's listening, keeping in mind that they're going to be coming from a range of sectors, industries, stages?
Sure. The big thing about insurance is, it's sometimes a bit of a misnomer when you're starting your own business. The great majority of small businesses start out of the home. It makes the most logical sense when we go back to the idea of scarce resources in the early stages and that startup stage, and what we sort of like to call the pre-startup phase, actually, because once you reach the startup page, a lot of this is already in place. But in that pre-startup phase, conceptualizing the idea, getting the ball rolling before you hit your hyper-growth period, is a lot of operating out of the home. And a lot of people think, well, it's okay, I have home insurance, or I have renter's insurance. But the reality is that in most instances, generally speaking, that insurance doesn't necessarily cover if you're operating a business, if you're storing product in your garage, if you're having people come in and out of your house to perform a service. There's a good chance that your insurance won't cover it. But by early on building that strong legal foundation, incorporating, setting up your business, making sure you have everything in place, like waivers if you are dealing with the public. There are different types of insurances available for you business insurance, general liability insurance. And these are the questions you have to ask. The one thing I always tell people in these presentations is ask the questions. Call your insurance company and say, if I'm running a business, then does my insurance cover me? And chances are it doesn't. So you have to ask those questions. Don't be afraid to use the resources available for you. You have an insurance adjuster, ask them these questions. It's really going to help you understand it and make sure you're protected in case something happens.
John,
yeah, just I want to add, maybe 2 practical points to that. So as Matthew said, there's the liability insurance, and depending on the field that you're operating in, it might actually be a requirement if you are looking to bid for government business that you actually have insurance in that area, and they would want to see evidence of that. The other thing I want to mention is that if you have a co-founder, sometimes you may feel that the business is not necessarily viable if the co-founder leaves you or sort of get hit by something really hard and merciless. In that case, there's something called a key man insurance that kind of gives money back to the corporation if one of the co-founders should happen to die. So, it's a life insurance. It's just with a twist that the beneficiary is the corporation itself.
And again, speaking of the somber, but to prevent problems later on, so thank you both for handling that question very deftly. And I mean, for a legal basics conversation, we really are jumping all over the place, which I think really speaks to how important this conversation is and how we call it basics, but how many of those basics there are. So we are at the end of our Q&A right now, but I would just like to close by asking our presenter, both of our presenters, just one quick fire question. And John, maybe we'll start with you this time. What advice would you give to those listening who are just starting out with their business? So one practical step that everyone can immediately take.
One practical step that everyone can immediately take. There are 100,000 things you need to do when you start a business, so it's a little bit difficult just to hone in on one, I would say. I think it's important to remember that when you're building a business is more than a product. It's the entirety of what you do. It includes the relationships that you have with your staff, with your customers, with potential partners. And to some extent, it includes the relationship to your family as well. And having a conversation with whoever you live with as your family and say, I'm starting a business, and it might have some implications for you, is a conversation that I think a lot of people neglect to have, so that the people that you love and who are near to you also are being included as part of the journey, that you consider their needs in the process, even though at times you'll be working a lot and you won't be seeing too much of them. I would definitely have a conversation with those people and say, this is what my expectations are in terms of my workload, how we manage vacations. This is my expectation in terms of making investments and commitments for the business. And this is what happens if things go really well for us.
So have those important early conversations. And Matthew, what about you? What's one immediate step that everyone can take?
When first starting their business?
Yes, and specifically on how to mitigate some of the legal risks that we've been talking about. So just if someone's just beginning and they're going to leave this call, one immediate step.
The most important thing you can do is to research. The most important thing is to come to things like this. Honestly, it is the first immediate thing you can do before you jump into it. You need to understand what's out there, what resources are out there to help you, and to really understand the landscape that you're entering. It's exciting to start a new business. It's incredibly exciting, and you want to jump 2 feet into it. But what's important is taking a breath, taking a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, and just saying, I need to understand what's out there. I need to understand the resources, and I have to understand what my industry looks like. If you take that breath right away before moving forward, if you've already moved forward, work that into it. Look in the evenings, understand it, and then get the advice that you need.
Excellent advice, though I imagine extremely hard for folks to follow as you are feeling like you're running, especially as John mentioned, how quickly things begin to go when you're even starting, but certainly beginning to grow. So thank you so much to you both for that key advice at the end here. And thank you everyone else for joining us. Our time has run out. So on behalf of all of our participants, the Hire Immigrants team, and our sponsor, RBC Royal Bank, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, John, for this really informative exchange of ideas. Thank you. So once the webinar recording and downloadable resources are available, you will be notified. These resources will be available at hireimmigrants.org. So please bookmark the page and share it with your colleagues and networks. So to our audience in Canada and beyond, please stay connected and stay tuned about one date in particular. If you sit on a board or report to a board, join the next Diversity on Board webinar in the Effective Governance series that is going to take place on June 28th. And this is on intercultural competence around the board table. We'll send out a link to that webinar as well. And finally, we value your feedback on today's session as well as your ideas for upcoming webinars. So please complete our online survey, which you will see in front of you. So just click on that. It'll just take a minute or two to fill out. And goodbye, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thank you very much, Matthew and John, once again. And to everyone else, we hope to see you back here next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.